Welcome to Equilibrium Echoes, the podcast where we delve into the transformative power of your inner world on your relationships. I'm your host, Alyssa Decker. Join me as we unlock the secrets of emotional equilibrium and dig deep into the tools and insights needed to foster healthier, more fulfilling relationships in ways that feel safe and authentic. My name is Alyssa Decker. I am your host, and I'm here today with CK Sims. I'm very excited to have you on the show today. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
CK, you are an author, a podcaster, and we have actually met before.
We have, yes.
We did. We recorded an episode for your podcast here a couple of weeks ago. And when I started this podcast, you were the first person I thought of to guest because we had such a fascinating conversation and I really wanted to hear more about your story. So why don't you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself, kind of give us a little background on who you are.
So not used to being in the hot seat, so forgive me. I'm CK Sims. I am a operations leadership change project manager consultant by profession. Like that's what I do for my 9 to 5. And I am a writer, as you had mentioned. Well, I'll correct that. I'll say I'm a storyteller because there is a distinction, right? So I can tell great stories, but I'm not like, say, your finest literary author you're ever going to come across. And podcaster. And I think, for me, this is all relatively new, this sort of chapter of my life. And it was because in 2023, I decided that I needed to step out from behind fear, which was constantly there and still is, by the way, and just do the things that I've wanted to do my whole life, but have just been too afraid to do. Um, so that's me in a nutshell. I'm 42, live in Montreal, Canada. I'm born and raised in Newfoundland, Canada. A lot of people don't know where that is, but it's just off the east coast of Canada. It's an island. Um, I have a cat. Her name is Mima. There's a whole story there, but we won't talk about that today. I think the Lord gave her to me to keep me humble and keep me tethered. Um, and yeah, that's me in a nutshell. I would think I'm a someone who loves to love and loves kindness, but I'm a pretty boring person, really.
Oh, I don't know about that. I think in the conversations we have had, you've had a lot to share, and I think they're very fascinating. So just as a little side note here, when we talked for the first time for your podcast, which is called Potting in My Noggin, we found that we have a lot in common.
Oh, yes, we
We
do.
we are the same age.
Mm.
We have similar things in our background, similar stories to tell in a lot of ways, and so that was really hilarious that we found that out live on camera. So, as you know, the focus of Equilibrium Echoes is really on learning how to do our inner work, learning how to manage our mindset, our emotions, our thoughts, and watching that inner work really kind of ripple out into our lives, rather than being so focused on trying to change our circumstances, which we feel like will make us happy.
Mhm.
We're doing the inner work and watching how that has this effect on our entire life, starting with us. So I would love to hear a little bit more about your story and kind of how inner work has really played out in your life. So I'm just going to let you kind of take it away and jump into what this has looked like for you.
Okay. Yeah. So to talk really quickly on what you just said, a lot of people think that if they get a new job or if they get that house that they want or if they move to that new town or if all of these external circumstances, if they get that, that's going to be it. they're going to be happy, they're going to be content, they're going to be, solid, everything's going to be great in life. And
Yes.
while initially it's going to feel that way, that novelty wears off and you're like, oh shit, and I apologize if this is a no swear zone.
You're good.
I'll
You're
try
good.
and keep it clean. But if you don't do the inner work will follow you everywhere. It doesn't matter what happens into your life. Yes, you're going to be distracted, whatever. So I've split my life into two zones, BC and AD. Not really, but before 35 and then after 35. And so we're going to talk about a little bit about what CK's life was like before 35. So CK was born a pastor's kid in a small rural town in Newfoundland. Um, Gay and knew it from a relatively young age. Like, I think came into truly understanding that he was an abomination and depravity of God at around the age of like 7 or 8.
Hmm.
Um, and do you have a comment?
Oh, I was just gonna say that must have had a really profound impact on you as a child to think of yourself and hear those things about those messages about yourself.
Oh, without question. Like it screwed me up, right? Like because
Yeah.
so I was raised in the church and I believed, you know, Jesus and God and the Holy Spirit and heaven and hell and all of those things and you know, I was indoctrinated, if you will, into that particular religion. And so I believed at a very young age that despite my love for God and love for Jesus and my Christian faith, that I was condemned to hell, regardless. Right? So this is something a 6 or 7 year old's going trying to like
Wow.
reconcile. And it wasn't something that I could come out and actually have an open conversation with my parents or anybody that these are the things that are going on inside my head. So then, to use more biblical terms, I felt like a leper, right? And
Mm-hmm.
but in my church, and I had to bear this burden by myself because there was no safe space to talk about it. So, obviously we grow up and I hit, adolescence, and then with adolescence, your hormones are like, and then your hormones of a teenage guy who's into dudes in a very rigorous Christian environment just kept piling on top of everything. And I just, was trying to sort of navigate life. And, I did things. I was sort of like a troubled kid, if you will, but not like I was mischievous, always up to no good, if you will, that sort of thing. Did a lot to defy my parents and teachings and things like that. But was always carrying the weight of this inner war, this inner battle that was always going to happen. And so I remember I wrote a letter, a very dirty letter. I mean, I think about it now and I cringe 7 ways from Sunday, but like I was in grade 8, right? And my science teacher at that time was older, but like there was something about him that was just absolutely the most sexy thing I've ever seen in my life. As an like, well, how old was I? 12, 13 in grade 8. So I wrote a very inappropriate letter to my teacher, and it was anonymous, but like I was like, write it, and I'm just gonna like walk past his office and flick it on his chair. And anyway, I did this. But then oh, we're going down memory lane. As I realized, um, walking through the front entrance at the school, I had in my hand a $2 bill, which is not a thing anymore, but it was a $2 bill, and the letter. And I had accidentally thrown the $2 bill on the chair in his office instead of the thingy. But I'm like, that was my lunch. So Bold Curtis, and that's my real name, y'all. So decides to go back and try and retrieve it and switch them out. And while in the process of doing that, the teacher sort of saw me like in his doorway. And then, long story short, I went about my class. I was outside during lunchtime, could hear him talking to the principal through the principal's office window if it's open. I get called to the principal's office, and next thing I know, my parents are there, and the principal tells me that they could have the letter fingerprinted if I don't fess up, all of this stuff, which I mean,
Wow.
42-year-old Curtis is saying, like, no, you couldn't. I was a minor. Like, you couldn't have done shit. Like,
Right.
you know what I mean? But, like, in grade eight, Curtis, like, raging hormones, completely lost, thinks he's an abomination and depravity of God, like, all of these things, scared, can't understand why he is gay. Why? Like, I did nothing wrong,
Hmm.
right, to deserve that at that time. And so, anyway, long story short, I ended up in therapy. But what really pissed me off and made me angry at that point was my parents put me in a Christian psychiatrist. So the messaging was, if you don't act on it, it's not a sin. So, like,
Mm.
nobody was talking to me about, hey, you know what? These emotions are they happen to a lot of people, and that's it was all still God related. And I think that was a huge turning point in my life where I just started to get um really angry towards my parents, all of those things. And so we go through high school. It's brutal. I leave high school, like, I hit the ground running. I couldn't get away from home fast enough. And I'm, free. Oh, that's not always good.
No, no, it's
I
not.
I was free, untethered, can do my own thing, free to be completely lost and on like misguided throughout my entire, like, from leaving high school, all my 20s up until I think things started to sort of shift at 27 for me, but that sort of 10-year period was a complete dumpster fire. Complete dumpster fire. Now, in all fairness, just because I don't want anybody to be like, you know, the while the psychiatrist, I believe, should have been had their license removed, is because they were not doing science. They were doing religion, right? However, during that time, they were operating off the DSM-3, and as you can't see them, as like my background's in mental health, right? DSM-3 still had homosexuality listed as a mental illness. Okay.
Mm.
So the support I would have received from the psychiatrist, even if he wasn't religious, would not necessarily have been like, these are feelings, these are emotions. They would have been how to prevent them, how to not do them, like all of that sort of thing. So it wouldn't have been what I needed anyway. So there's that. Go
But
ahead.
even still, I just got to make this point because if you're a Christian, if you call yourself a Christian,
Mhm.
if you believe that Jesus is who he says he is and that what he teaches, what he taught is how you're going to live your life, there is no excuse for not showing up and first and foremost loving and caring for the people, whether you agree with their decisions or not. We should always start there. That is like, and it just really ticks me off when We have churches and counselors and whoever, I don't care who you are. You call yourself a Christian and you show up with anything but the foundation of loving people the way Jesus did. And as a little side note, kind of a pet peeve of mine as well, is Christian counselors who are really focused on Christianity over solid science and what it really looks like to help people with their mental health. When
That is a
it's
whole topic we
it
could
is.
literally have like 5 podcast episodes on, I think. Because, for me, I call it weaponizing Christ,
Yes.
right? And we have a lot of people out there who say that they're Christians who like to weaponize Christ. But then we have a
Yeah.
lot of really wonderful, true Christians that are not loud and making big waves, who do love first and tolerate and accept and show warmth and the love of God too, right? And those are the people who need to speak up louder now and get out in the streets. But it's not about lip service. You have to show now everybody what Jesus's love looks like.
Exactly. And if you believe Jesus is who he says he is
Hmm.
and you love people, he my philosophy is if someone is doing something that is a sin, that is wrong, right? First of all, it's not my decision, not my opinion is not the one that matters on whether something is right or wrong. But second of all, God is completely 100% capable of convicting other people of their sin. He does not need me to do that, right? So if there is an issue and somebody has a sin in their life, that's his job, not mine. And we get so sidetracked by this. We feel like we have to preach and tell other people what they're doing wrong. And that's not our job in any way.
That's
So anyway,
children.
I'm sorry. I totally derailed you on your story, but please continue.
No, no, no. It's good. It's a great topic. So yeah, so dumpster fire of a life. I was sort of a transient, I guess, if you will, like popping around from sort of province to city to province and no real roots. And I think it was, 26, 27 when I sort of started to lay a little bit more of a, um, a shallow root system in my life. But it was, I was just such a lost person, not a good person either. And I talked about this on my podcast. Like, because of, when I left high school, I was in school, I was bullied relentlessly. So when I left high school, I decided that no longer would I be the one bullied, I would be the one to bully. So it was
Hmm.
like I'm sort of an extremist. So I was like I went from one extreme to the other. And I was just not a nice person and I was cruel and mean and I did things that were unsavory and like just so many different things that I look back and I literally cringe because like when I think about who I am today, any of those things like I would be like I could never. But I did, right? And so at 29 years old, I went, well, okay, I'm going to touch on this story real quick because I think this is important for the overarching change. Um, at 26, I reconnected with a friend that I met in when I was around 18 years old. And I'm going to gloss over this, but it's important, I guess. We met, she had an overdose, I saved her life, we bonded, so we're still best friends today. She's my best friend today. But anyway, I met this person, and I was living in Toronto, and she was living an hour away in Barrie. I didn't take public transit, and I was a complete mess. And so anyway, she wanted me to come up for a weekend, but she didn't drive on the highway, and I was like, well, what am I gonna do? So I had to get on a bus. Sounds it's a big thing, big deal. Get on a bus and go to see her. But I went to see her for this weekend, and everything leading up to this point, my life was just like so many drugs, parties, like not real friendships, nothing like that. Um, I went and spent this weekend. I actually spent a week with her, but I spent this time with her, and I like they had normal lives. Like she had a normal life. Like her husband or her boyfriend at the time, worked. They had a really nice like townhouse. They had people over on the weekend, and it was just like this really nice party. But it wasn't a party because like it was just a bit of drinking and some laughter and games and just like adult normal lives. And I went back to my place in Toronto, and I was like, I want that. Like I
Mm.
want that. Why can't I have that? I can have that, no? And I said to myself, I'm like, I'm not okay. I'm sad all the time. Maybe I need to actually, and I was, which is funny and contradictory, because I was totally against going on medication for mental health, like, because I had this assumption in my mind that it would change who you were. No, I
Mm.
had no problems with like doing ecstasy and ketamine and cocaine and smoking some occasional crack and crystal meth and all that. So I had nothing, no problems with that, but I have problems with taking a pill that could help my overall sort of whatever. So anyway, I did research. That's who I am as a person. I've always been that person. I've researched everything. I want to find out how things interact, blah, 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 blah. So I went to a walk-in clinic because getting a doctor in Canada is like almost impossible. And met with the doctor and I told him what was going on and I said like I just want to take some control back in my life and I explained going to my now best friend's house and having this sort of normal weekend and like just it was just so absurd and like just it was I never experienced it before. Like you could be an adult like this and like have normal adult relationships. And so anyway, he luckily he went and he said, well, typically, and he's the only person I've ever met who actually said you should see a psychologist or a psychiatrist to get this medication. I was like, that'll take forever. I want to start now. This is the drug I want, which is the citalopram. I'm like, this is the dosage that I want to start off. This is the seemingly normal dosage for most people starting off. I want to start. And so after some back and forth, he did prescribe me the medication, and I went home. And I remember having a conversation with myself because I was like a hermit. And it's interesting. I went to check for time, but I'm a guest. I don't see the time. So, um, so you keep me on track. But I went and the night I went to take the pill before bed, I was standing in my little tiny studio apartment out the back window smoking a cigarette, and I said, "Okay, you're gonna take this pill, but you have to like also take steps to make sure you get the best out of this pill.
Mm.
So like you have to like do some things that you normally wouldn't do. Public transit, going out where people were going. Like I was like literally like I would say that I was probably very on the cusp of agoraphobic at that point in my life. And like you have to put your best foot forward because the pill can't do everything for you. You have to try and do some stuff for yourself. So that's great. I moved. What ended from this is that I ended up moving in with my best friend and her partner at that time, like a month or two later, and then sort of the healing began. I talked about this in a podcast once as well. The pivotal role that my best friend played in who I am today because she showed me something that I had not experienced before. Okay.
Mm.
And that was unconditional love.
Yes.
And I never felt that I had that before. My parents would argue that they would unconditionally love me regardless. And we have a great relationship today, FYI, just for everybody knowing, my parents and I. But I never felt that it was unconditional love. So Cindy was able to provide me unconditional love. So like I knew apart from like say killing her husband or family, like there's nothing I could do to destroy that. And then she was the first person that I consciously made like a decision that I'm like, I'm not going to use her in any way. I don't
Hmm.
want to use this person. So there was this choice, right? So it is important. I wanted to tell that part of the story because I feel like it laid a framework and the groundwork for what was to come. Now, we're fast forward a few years. I go and I see a psychiatrist, and we spend 12 sessions, 12 1 hour sessions, going through every part of my life. And throughout those 12 sessions, like we went back to like my earliest childhood memory, like all kinds of things. Long story short, I went back on the 13th visit and we sat down and he was like, okay, so he's like, based on all of my findings and everything we've talked about, I have a diagnosis for you. And I'm like, okay. And he's like, you have type 2 bipolar disorder. And I'm like, oh. And he's like, you've had it since you were 13 at least. And I'm like, okay. And I was like, okay, wait. And I'm not processing this right now. I need to go. So I left, and then I'm like thinking about it because at first I was like, oh, I don't like this. Like now there's now I'm labeled. Like I don't know how I feel about this. But then I remember driving. And I called my best friend who like when any major thing happens in my life, she's one of the first people to know, if not always the first. And I just told her, and she's like, makes sense. And I'm like, oh, okay.
Wait, what?
Yeah, she was like, yeah, makes sense. Yeah, like, kind of makes sense. And I'm like, well, hold up. I'm like, so I took a few days and I started researching type 2 bipolar disorder because we hear these things, right? And we automatically assign some sort of meaning to it.
Hmm.
And in that moment, I was assigning that I belonged in a psychiatric hospital for the rest of my life. Like that I catastrophized the F out of that diagnosis without
Yeah.
really giving the psychiatrist enough time to truly explain everything for me. But long story short, I was like reading all the symptomology and researching it like nobody's business. And I'm like, oh shit, I really am. I'm like, I'm like, I fit all these boxes. And like, it talks about because there's bipolar, there's type 2 bipolar, and then there's dysthymia. And I never pronounce that word properly. Just anybody out there who actually knows what I'm talking about, forgive me for my pronunciation because I always mess it up. But now there's another one before the D one, dysthymia section. Um, so bipolar is you have schizophrenic tendencies, right? And the way I tend to highlight the difference is that bipolar people can think that they have a direct link with God. Like that's the ability of the like the mania, if you will. Type 2 bipolar is hypomania, and you tend to be more in the depressive state. So the hypomania actually just feels really good, technically. And so this is also why so many people who might actually have type 2 bipolar disorder go undiagnosed because nobody goes to the hospital or to see someone when they're feeling good. But how it manifests is that you get really irritable, you're agitated, you get these grandiose ideas like, I'm going to move to Mexico and like start a lemonade stand, and this is just going to be the best thing ever. And it kind of speaks to what we talked about earlier about the fact that the next big thing, the external circumstances that we want to change that's going to fix everything, right? And it's that on like steroids, hypomania. So anyway, long story short, I accepted my diagnosis and I decided I didn't want to be a victim of the diagnosis. And one of the other cool feelings I had after getting it is that I'm like, I spent my whole life feeling like there was something wrong with me. Like I didn't function like other people.
Hmm.
But now it was sort of also like a validation. I'm like, well, there was something wrong with you. and not necessarily something wrong in a negative connotation, but like your brain didn't function like everybody else's. And the world's not designed for someone with a disorder, right? So
Right.
here's where it gets dark. Like most psychiatrists and doctors, when they you have a medical condition, which type two bipolar disorder is a medical condition, they throw all the medications they can at it,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this, I look back now with such clarity, right? Hindsight is 2020. But I was just thinking to myself, like, okay, well, they know best. Maybe I need all this stuff. And in around 2014, my best friend and her husband and I decided to move back to Newfoundland. Um, and I was ready for a change, really. So when I left Ontario and we moved to Newfoundland, I was on 12 different medications for the brain.
Wow.
And one of my quick stories is, and this is one thing I will tell people out there, I won't tell you any medication advice except you need to advocate for yourself. Like
Yes.
if you're on a pill for GERD, right? And you're also on a pill for your mental health, and then the doctor, you go and say your GERD pill's not working so well and they want to change your mental health pill, tell them no, change the GERD pill,
Mm,
right? So anyway,
yeah.
I have to drink water. So we're leading up here. We're going back to Newfoundland. I was on 12 different medications and I was a zombie and entered darkness. And prior to all of this starting to happen, I was the type of person who couldn't understand how, and I always use Robin Williams as an example. Robin Williams could kill themselves,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I'm like, you have it all, and like, all of those particular things. Like, what kind of mindset must they be in to take their lives?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have a similar thought when we hear about a celebrity suicide.
Yeah, but like even I think it's a shock for people who know non-celebrities. You just seem really happy all the time, all of those things. So 2014 to 2017, I call the dark ages. And what I mean by that is I had already up to this point lived a theatrically dumpster fire messed up life, right? My external circumstances were always shitty, hard to keep a job. I was lost. Like I had developed really strong relationship with my best friend and her partner, so like that was a really great part of my life. And what I loved about them is that they just accepted me for me, right? I
Mm-hmm.
also did not have that prior.
Right.
So, in that period from 2000 to 2017, with all of the different medications, moving to Newfoundland, which is kind of gloomy, Newfies are great, but like it's a lot of rain, drizzle, and fog in Newfoundland, especially in St. John. So, it's like it just wasn't great for the mental health. And I slipped into this, one day I'll write about it and I'll write it out well, but I slipped into this darkness. And it happened over time, but it got worse over time. And what I mean by that is that, say you're in a room and the eclipse happens and things get really dark, but then all of a sudden, like you're surrounded by this, growing sort of gelish membrane type thing where sound gets muffled, your vision's slightly blurred. You can't see things typically that clearly. Now, I function fine. I could drive, I could work, all of that stuff. But the inside of me became darkness. I would have increasingly terrible thoughts about unaliving myself. I can't believe I just used that. I'm such a millennial right now, but like unaliving myself. And just that darkness eventually turned into hopelessness. And that's the part that really I struggled with. In darkness, I could still carry on a normal life. People didn't know anything. I could have momentary sort of fits of laughter with people. I could, but I wasn't invested. It was very surface. The hopelessness is really what kind of just sucked everything out, right? It's you get to a point where the idea of a trip comes up. What happens when someone thinks about taking a trip? They get excited
Right.
and they start to think ahead and they're like, oh, this might be great. But what was happening to me was an idea of a trip would come up and then all of a sudden it was like, well, what's the point?
Mm,
It doesn't matter anyway.
yeah.
Like there's no joy left and you can't experience joy. The joy is gone. Everything is gone. And everything becomes bleak, a dark hole, an abyss. You go through the emotions, but going through the emotions and trying to pretend for like 2 to 3 years becomes extraordinarily exhausting. And then for me, at 35, just before 35, um, I decided that I was going to take back control of my life and unalive myself. And like you might want a trigger warning this particular podcast, but you know that I kind of talk lightly about it because I've told the story many times in to teams I've led or things like that because it's an important story, but I felt in that moment that there was no other option for me. I had tried everything. I was exhausted. I was tired. There was no joy. Like there was just nothing. It was
Right.
like just an existence, and there was nothing. And so I tried. I was very methodical, very strategic in how I was going to do it. And somehow I had failed and woke up, and ended up in a hospital in a short stay unit for 3 days. And I was mad. I was really mad, Alyssa,
Hmm.
because my initial thought was, how could you be so stupid that you this up? Like, come on. Like
Yeah.
that's where I was at, right? And then
Hmm.
in that moment, the week leading up from when I decided to take my life with resolve, I things just seemed so clear, right? I had figured out where I was going to do it, how I was going to do it, when I was going to do it, just to prevent any like extra mess for anybody to clean up. I knew that it was going to have an impact. All like these are the things that I thought about. I was just super clear. I was super committed to doing it because it was like, okay, well, I get to go out on my own terms,
Right.
right? So,
Yeah, it gives you that sense of control back and purpose. Like there's suddenly some. So we have this in common as well. Made a suicide attempt when I was in my teens, and yeah, I remember that feeling of like there's just this black void of lack of emotion, lack of purpose, and then all of a sudden this idea comes and you latch onto it because there is that sense of purpose, there is that clarity, and it's like this is the one thing in my life that makes sense. And suicide is such a internal struggle. It's so personal and it's so in your head. It's so this is why people don't see it coming because
yes,
it's such an internal struggle that I think doesn't we don't talk about it
we need
when we're
to.
in that, right?
Yeah, but we need to make it such a normal part of conversation that somebody who's in it personally and happens to hear someone talk about suicide, oh, I feel like that some days. Like
Yeah.
that, and it wouldn't be met with because I have a controversial view on the fact that if somebody wants to commit suicide, they should be allowed. And the reason I say that is because when you're in it like that, you don't need to have an option taken away from you.
Yes, because I think that's why if you're in that moment, like when I was suicidal, I didn't tell anybody because I didn't want anybody to talk me out of it or try to take that option away from me.
And that's
That's
it's the
exactly why.
autonomy, right? And that's
Yes.
part of the appeal. That was the part of the appeal for me was I'm going out on my own terms. I am now ending my misery
Yeah.
because I choose to. So if somebody prevented me from doing this, that would have I would have felt like they had taken my power away.
Yes, and most people who are in that situation, I mean, I'm just speaking, I guess, for myself here, but I had so much power already taken away from me.
Mhm.
I felt like if someone takes this away from me, then I literally have nothing left. And so there was nothing at that point, I don't think, that would have gotten me to open my mouth and tell someone what was going on because I didn't, I just was so afraid that someone would take that from me.
Yeah, I think it's really important that people understand that that is their choice. And someone who tr makes an attempt and survives that attempt, they should not be shamed. They should not be like that is a choice for them to make. We are in a period now in life with MAID, right?
Hmm.
So in Canada, you can, depending on your situations, and it's a very long sort of process, but you can die with dignity with doctor assisted. So it's their right, it's their choice. When I woke up in the hospital, I was mad. And my intent at that time was you're going to get the F out of here and you're going to do a better job,
Mm.
right? And then I'm not sure how we're doing for time, but
We have about 20 minutes left.
okay.
So
So
I
we're
want to
going
make
to,
sure we get to the end of your story because I
yeah,
want
so we're
to,
going
or
to pivot because this, everything that I just told you was pre 35. And like I said, I lead from I tell my story from pre 35 and then a post 35. So we're going to switch now. So I made the attempt, dumpster fire of life. Everything was awful. Um, and everything, yeah, it was just awful. And in that hospital, for those 3 days, I talked to so many different people. And I discovered from, and because we have 20 minutes, I won't go too deep into the conversation that happened. But a male practitioner came in and kind of just looked at me really chill, like really genuine, like what's going on? And in that moment, I poured out so like just unleashed everything and just kind of kept saying that I'm so tired because trust me, people who are choosing to like die by suicide, they are tired of pretending. They're tired of trying to be okay. And that doctor or practitioner, I couldn't tell you his name or what his rank was. He said to me to just stop swimming. 3 words, the antithesis of Dory, Finding Dory. Um, but those 3 words sort of hit me, and I was like, well, I tried to do that and failed. But what he was talking about, and then what I discussed a little bit more with psychiatrists later that day and the day after, is radical acceptance. So I have type 2 bipolar disorder. I spent my life being completely messed up. I needed to accept that that was who I was in that moment and stop fighting it, right? I spent so much energy on trying to be normal that I had no energy for anything else. But I was not normal, right? I didn't fit in a box that was, designed by the church or normal day society. I was not normal. And I just had to stop fighting against it. So keep in mind now, I was still pretty intent on completing suicide when I got out. And it was the day before I got out that I realized that I actually didn't want to die. Okay? Here's the piece.
okay.
I wanted to live, but I wanted to live without so much pain,
Yes.
right? And the radical acceptance piece was sort of a pivotal part for me because I had not tried that before. But the other component was while I was in there, we talked about cognitive restructuring. Okay. And that's a fancy term for changing your internal dialogue.
Hmm.
Okay. And so these are two things I had not tried before. So I was like, you know what? Well, I haven't actually tried these things before. Like I didn't, they weren't in my scope of options or that even that if they were even plausible. So what did this look like? How was it going to play out? So I was like, you know what? I made a deal with myself. You're going to get out and you're going to give this an honest effort. But like, you're going to have to mix some things up here because it's not working the way it's been this last 35 years. So we got to switch some things up. So I got out of the short stay unit and primarily because they couldn't keep me there, right? Like,
Hmm.
I didn't really pose a threat. If I wanted to complete, I could have, but they really couldn't keep me there. Um, so I went home and I started thinking, okay, so what does it look like to radically accept that you're not okay,
Mm.
right? And then I'm like, okay, well, I do know a few things. I'm on way too many medication. I'm coming off them all. So I went to my doctor and I said, I'm coming off all my medications. I don't recommend this for anybody listening. I recommend work with your doctor. But I said to my doctor, I was like, I'm coming off all of medications. And then she said, no. And I'm like, well, you don't have a choice in this. I'm like, now you can either support me on this journey, right?
Hmm.
Or I'm just going to come off of them and, whatever. I'm like, what's going to happen is I'm going to come off and then in a little while, I'm going to see how things are going and I'm going to come back to you. And I'm going to be very specific about what it is I need and what we're going to do. So I did. I dropped off all 12 medications. Um, didn't go out much, but what I did was I stayed in my house and which I love, I'm a homebody. Um, so now I had to think about, okay, internally, I was always a dumpster fire. And internally, I was always trying to put that fire out and pretty it up and make it look like this cute little house in Texas with the white picket fence and the little doggy in the yard. Like, but no, like that was no more pretending. And it came down to saying, you know what? I'm not okay. I'm not going to pretend anymore and just accepting it. And the whole goal there for anybody listening is that you are actually observing what's happening around you and not absorbing what's happening around you. And there's such a distinction and a power in that I because I wasn't fighting against the sadness and obviously with taking off all those medications sort of at once there was a sort of an onslaught of like withdrawal symptoms and you name it. So like that first little while was really rough,
Oh, yeah.
really rough. But I was like, okay, if I need to lay in bed all day, then I'm going to lay in bed all day. If I need to hydrate or read or whatever, that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to fight against it. I'm not going to try and be anything that I'm not. So that was that first step. And then cognitive restructuring was the real work. Okay. Because it once you accept that you're going to accept who you are and no longer fight about it, yeah, it takes a little bit of an adjustment to stop that impulse to fight against it, but it's not the real work. The real work comes from here's my truth. Because of the way I was raised in the church, being gay, believing that I was always condemned to hell, right?
Hmm.
Like, I couldn't be a Christian because I was gay. I couldn't be a gay because I was going to go to hell. There's this always this inner war. I grew up with a really shitty internal dialogue. Now everybody has internal dialogue. I think there's atypicals out there who say they don't, and I find this really hard to
Me too. Me
process.
too.
But like my dialogue has always been very awful, and even during my meanest, cruelest days in my 20s, the shit I said to myself, I would never dream of saying to someone else. And I can't even begin to tell you how terrible I spoke to myself on the inside.
Mm.
There was no grace, there was no kindness, there was no love. You know, you would think, and I think, it was evident that I hated every piece of who I was. There was nothing that I looked at internally, externally, that I could find something about myself that I loved or even liked. Let's start small. And that really stems from faulty assumptions and lies we tell ourselves as children. And then we base a foundation of our life on it, right? So
Hmm.
here's what I had to do. And because I'm an animated person, I will show you how I sort of animated myself on a regular basis. So I started waking up in the morning, and because I wasn't fighting against who I was naturally, depressed, anxious, bipolar 2, all of that stuff, I actually had some energy to like do real work. So I'm like, okay, let's give this a try. So I started, and it really is so rudimentary what I'm about to say. I would have a thought come into my mind. Say, and here's where I struggle now, it being like almost 9 years later, right? Is that trying to think like I did back then is a bit of a struggle to remember all of the awful things I used to say to myself because I don't do that anymore. Like that's not a part of my existence anymore. So, but like let's say it. The typical dialogue was, "You're a disgusting piece of trash. Like you have no right to even be breathing. You're gonna go to hell. Like God hates you. Everybody hates you. Like all of these like just onslaught all the time." So I would have a thought come into my mind and say, I'm going to use for an example this interview. You're interviewing Curtis at 35, right? Oh, I can't believe that you said that. You're such a fucking idiot. Like, why would you say something like that? The whole world's now going to laugh at you. You're so despicable. You're a shame to your family. Like, you should just die. Something really terrible. And I would be like, nope, and take that thought and everything I just said. And I'm like, okay, my goal was to rephrase this thought from being negative to at least the very minimum neutral, if possible, a positive. So I would have to actually go and like holding it. I'm still holding it in my hand. Okay, so this thought now is going to become, you know what? You made a mistake. Perhaps you shouldn't have said that, but everyone's allowed to make mistakes. You're a human. It's okay. And then put it back inside. And people at home watching might be like, this guy is crazy. Like, whoa. But let me tell you, all like for 6 months longer, in the beginning, it was a lot more. It would be a thought come in my mind. I could be washing dishes. I could be doing anything. And I would have the thought and I would grab it as soon as it came in because I felt like it needed to be somewhat tangible, like an action for me. It could be different for someone else. Someone else could be able to do it just in their mind. But for me, I grabbed it, I looked at it, and all of its disgustingness because it was such an awful thing to say to someone or to myself, and then I would rephrase it to be neutral or positive, and then put it back inside. So one of the psychiatrists told me you have to imagine that your inner self is a 3-year-old child. And when that 3-year-old child makes a mistake, when that 3-year-old child hurts themselves or does something naughty or bad or whatever, how do you respond to them? Like, how would you personally respond to a child that you saw say the wrong thing and get really upset about it? And so that's what I had to do is it almost became a separation. Like there's the exterior me and the internal me sort of thing. And the exterior me needed to work on the internal me, if you will, because the internal me needed a lot of love and a lot of sort of reassurance from the life that I've led. So I started to speak to myself as if I was speaking to a 3-year-old child, not with baby talk, but like with kindness, gentleness, compassion, and grace. I would tell myself on a regular basis, you know what? I did not even hold myself like this and be like, you're okay. You are enough. You are good. I've got you. And throughout this process, and I know that we're, coming up on time, but throughout this process, it was a lot of weird little sort of quirky things like touching, giving myself warm squeezes, catching those thoughts, putting them back in, all of that sort of thing. The goal was to become my own sort of best friend, my own rock, my
Yeah.
own constant, my own cheerleader, all of those things. And now I will tell you the coolest thing ever. I'll never forget this. It was like 6 months after all this happened. I had already gone back to the doctor and I had said I need this medication and this medication and I need them at this milligrams and this milligrams. And they were like, well, that's below therapeutic value. And I'm like, well, I just need a little help. So we're going to start there and I'll come back to my need more. And that's the medication that I've been on for the last almost 9 years. I never changed it. It's just enough to keep me regulated, right? So 6 months in, I remember getting ready for bed and going to grab, putting my water on my nightstand. I was probably gonna go pee, and I stopped dead in my tracks in my bedroom, and I'm like standing there. And remember, I'm an animated person, so I was probably doing these exact movements. But I realized that the whole day had gone by, and I hadn't had a single negative thought.
Wow.
And I'm like, wait a second. I'm like, and so then almost to like dispel this truth, I went into my brain and searched drastically to try and find at least one time throughout that day where I had a negative thought. But I couldn't. And 20 minutes later, I realized that this was like a day where I had zero negative thoughts, zero trash talk to myself. And it was like a celebration. And I remember texting my best friend and being like, oh my God, like I just went a whole day with no negative thoughts. Like, what the hell? And that was sort of the realization for me that I was on the right track to reprogramming inside here. And that
Yeah.
was 35 years of really bad messaging and all of that stuff. So to clue it up, I was 35. I'm turning 43 this summer. I had to focus in on my internal dialogue, internal beliefs, internal everything, and work with changing that. Excuse me. And still a smoker. Not proud, but I'm just saying, still a smoker. So I went in and I had to do that. Fast forward a few years because after this, I, went back to school, did some counseling psychology education, started working a job. I've been gainfully employed now for many, many years. Well, 8 years, almost 9 years, I guess. Which is really bizarre because that was not my life before 35. I'm in Montreal. I went shopping. I'm driving down the highway towards home, and I'm just driving, and all of a sudden, like this big, like massive smile comes on my face, and I'm like just looking out and thinking to myself, I'm like, oh, everybody in these cars that are driving next to me also has a story. Like, I hope that their stories are good. I hope their hearts are well, like all of those things. And as I'm having this happen to me, it dawns on me, like, who is this person? Who is this person that just starts smiling because why not? While you're driving from point A to point B, who sees life and finds the beauty in absolutely everything, who looks at people as not just people, but a collection of decisions and stories and everything that makes them who they are, who has this heart that wants to explode because it's filled with love for others, and like this person who's navigating and um figuring out the next steps for a six-figure consulting gig, who's written a book, who's started a podcast, who's connecting with Alyssa Decker from Texas on her podcast, telling myself, who is this person and how did I get here? It was not because I moved from Newfoundland to Montreal. It was not because I went into a short stay unit for a mental health the hospital. It was not because I've made any external changing decision in my life. It is because I chose to go on the inside, do the work, and learn to love myself. And that
Yes.
has been the most freeing, life changing thing I could ever do. I have not thought about suicide in almost 9 years. Like, and the idea of it is like why? Life is wonderful. Like, you know what I mean? Like, life is really wonderful. Life is what you make it. And
Right.
I am just, and I realized through all of this, and I know I just found the time when I can see it on Riverside on the other end. I know we're over, so apologies to everybody
It's all
home.
right.
But like I am, this I'm just so grateful because if I had succeeded back then in completing dying by suicide, I'm trying to stay up with the terms because I know completing suicide is not the proper term anymore. Um, I would have missed out on so much, like so many wonderful things. And like I'm by default a positive person. What? I beg your pardon? Huh? Um, Not the same person I was pre 35.
Right.
Like, put them both in the same room, like, they're both going to be preaching at each other. Well, actually, I might be like trying to be kind to younger me, and the younger me might be telling me to go F myself. It's probably somewhere where that would look like, right?
Yeah.
But it's so important. Anybody who's going through it, when you start looking on the inside, monitoring those thoughts and working on changing those thoughts, that's when you're going to start to see change. And all of the good stuff comes from when it comes from the inside outwards.
Yes. So powerful. I used to really write off this whole mindset thing for so long. I didn't really understand the power that it has, but it is, I mean, just like your story shows, it's incredibly powerful and
Yes.
really can change everything, absolutely everything. Thank you so much for sharing your story. I wish we had time to go further into this, and maybe we'll do a follow up
Sure.
conversation here at some point, because I really would like to dig in more to all of the things that you went through, the process you went through in changing all of that internal dialogue and the mindset work.
That
Because
could
we
be,
only
yes.
really scratched the surface
Yes.
here.
So, and there are steps that you can take, right? And there is sort of like methodology you can apply, all of that stuff that I did apply, but it's showing up for yourself consistently and consistently catching those thoughts and changing them
Right.
is the foundation. And then as you continue going on, one last thing I'm going to leave you with though. And I'm just going to leave you this. I know we're over time, but we'll see if we can cut it off at 105. Um, I'm a by default positive person now. My internal dialogue has completely changed. I still overthink though, right? I still get anxious
Mm-hmm.
and I still catastrophize. So like it's keep in mind that these are just like personality sort of things that you might have. If you show yourself enough love in the process, you'll be able to combat all of those things
Yes.
without, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it's become before coming on here today, was nervous. I mean, I'm nervous for my appointment at 1 o'clock, which is in 15 minutes. So like, but I do it anyway because I know that I love myself enough to show up.
Yes. And you're able to develop strategies for coping with that in a healthy way
Absolutely.
and not letting it completely derail your life.
Absolutely.
Yes.
But yeah, thank you so much for having me.
It was my pleasure. Thanks so much for joining me. And for all of you listening in, thank you for being here, and we will see you on the next episode.